Hi, folks. You're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the quite famous 1950s novel, The Quiet American, which was written by British novelist Graham Greene, and was quite a successful novel in the overall. I think it's still in print today, and was required reading at high school when I was going through high school. And I can't say I thought that much of it at the time, but I came back to it years later and appreciated quite a bit more. Just the setting. We're talking about 1950s Vietnam, early 1950s Vietnam, where the French are still around, but where the United States is becoming, more and more indirectly, more and more involved. And they're sending various political emissaries and representatives, and you could even say agitators, to Vietnam. The US can sense that the French are having a bit of a struggle here, and they think the solution is to turn the Vietnamese away from communism. And in order to do that, just say, well, look, you can have democracy. The people can choose, and try and turn Vietnam, this agricultural third world, very tribal society, try and turn it into a Western style democracy. So Graham Greene was around in Asia at the time, and you can see the British viewpoint. The British have been really world hegemons in terms of colonies and empires for over 100 years, well over 100 years, in fact. So they fancy themselves, the British fancy themselves as experts on foreign policy and what will or won't work in this or that place, and to what extent democracy or self-government or whatever is possible, and under what circumstances, and so on. Now, the British have got a lot of experience at this, of course. They've been at it for a long time, but Britain was no longer a world power at this stage. In fact, they were struggling to even hang on to it, to be a second-rate power. They were just about to slip into the third-rate power status. So the British were no longer running the show, and their opinions didn't really matter. Now, because of the piss-poor, amateurist showing in World War II, the Americans tended to dismiss the British views and opinions as, you guys are nothing much anymore. Why should we listen to you? And so therefore, whatever advice or suggestions that the British were making were not really being accepted much by the US, generally the foreign policy position. But bear in mind that at the end of World War II, almost 50% of the world's economy was in the United States. Massive clout. I don't think you've ever seen clout of this proportions anytime, anywhere in history, but certainly not on a global scale. So the American foreign policy was that we're creating a new world. We're building a new world, and we're building a world that the failed states of Europe, Britain and so on, France, the failed states of Europe, their ideas and their attitudes and views are so yesterday. We have the future, and we're applying it now. The British position was that the Americans were hopelessly naive, and there's a certain degree of resentment that people that naive are now in control. And this comes out in I believe comes out in Graham Greene's novel. How can these amateurs be deciding, look at the silly mistakes they're making, they should listen to us and get the British and get some decent guidance. So the novel revolves around this British journalist. It's kind of minimally autobiographical in a way, but this British journalist in Vietnam, he's married, but he's got an English wife, I don't know, somewhere in England, I guess, and he's taken up with a Vietnamese chick that's got to be like half his age, third of his age, and she likes the relationship because she gets to hang out with a first world guy with a nice place to live and nice food to eat and going out to nice places and going to embassy parties. So she's happy with that arrangement. He gets, a young piece of ass to hump, so he's okay with it. And along comes the American emissary. Now he's not clear, the American political emissary, that what his role is, and his role is as an agitator. And in Vietnam, his role is to try and create or foment, or at least materially contribute to circumstances where Vietnam will become a Western democratic state. And he's very idealistic in his view, believes that, well, what's wrong with democracy? What's wrong with the people voting to choose their government? So it sounds pretty good to me. And it does in the West, and with people that have developed, over centuries, have developed those sorts of concepts of power sharing and civic responsibility and all those sorts of things that have created modern day Western democracy. But they don't really work outside of that. The Islamic Republic's democracy's got, just about a zip chance of getting off the ground, or in any meaningful sort of way. In tribal societies and peasant societies, agricultural societies, democracy doesn't really have much of a show. And this was something that the idealistic American said, well, that's bullshit. People want to choose their government, surely. So he's running around in a society that's got no concept of civic responsibility or civic involvement, and beyond the rural village level, agricultural village level, and he's talking about national democratic institutions that that these people have whether then or today have almost no chance of understanding or comprehending or even wanting in a lot of ways. Now, to add some sort of spice to it all, the novelist Graham Greene has added that the American Gomer Pyle, the quiet American, he's also keen on the young Vietnamese chick that the British journalist is consorting with. So, the Americans say, well, you should, why don't you come away with me? You don't want that old guy. The journalist, the novelist Graham Greene, or the character he's created, he is rather annoyed by this and sees the American guy as just not only a naive fool in a political sense, but also an irritant. Why are you trying to take away my girl? You asshole. So the two things sort of blend together in the story. I just want to come back, though, to this idea of that, because it's an ideological imposition in its way, that the Americans, or anyone for that matter, can believe that, well, we can just flick a switch and create democracy here, that we can do it. Well, we've got it. Well, we've got works for us. We're exporting democracy. We're showing these people that. But the reality was of course quite different. The Americans, wherever they've tried to put democracy, whether it's Iraq and recently, or Vietnam back in the day, or wherever, it's always been a complete and total failure of the first order. And the Americans never seem to have understood this. Why was American foreign policy trying to push the Western democratic institutions onto an agricultural third world society in the 1950s and through the 1960s, and was still making the same mistakes in the 2000s and even today. It's hard to follow why the Americans would have 50 plus years, because they've been the preeminent hegemon sort of following World War II, and throughout most of that post World War II era, the Americans have had the view in their foreign policy that they can export democracy and those sorts of things, or at least the mirage of it. So, but it's been a complete and total failure. In the more recent years, the Americans have doubled down, using their economic clout, to force globalist policies on various countries. So, well, you better have a lesbian counselling service downtown. You have to arbitrarily arrest any man who's behind in his child support, and you have to have gay lesbian marches down the main street and drag queen story hours and this and that, and racist division, social division through racist lines, along gender lines, and so on and so forth. So the Americans have been heavily exporting that. That's what the war with Vladimir Putin's about. It's not about Ukraine or anything. It's that they want Russia to be drawn into the globalist cabal, and they've got to have gay lesbian marches down the main street of Moscow, and that's what the war's about. All these people dying for nothing other than forcing Putin to become a globalist flunky. I mean, for goodness sakes. But this is the extent they're prepared to go to, the globalists. A war where millions die in Ukraine, rigging US presidential elections, rigging court cases. And I mean, the list just goes on. There's nothing they're not prepared to do to get their globalist world order, which they sense now is slipping from their grasp, and about time too. What a fucking disaster that's all been. So The Quiet American, the novel, we can sort of see the type of hubris in the United States, and they can export Western values and American values, or what they dress up as democratic values, to these third world countries, but create far more problems than were there to begin with. Not only does the whole idea fail, and for obvious reasons, and the British kept telling the Americans this, it doesn't work in these sorts of societies, don't bother trying. But the Americans insisted it was possible, and anyone that they couldn't convert ideologically to accept democracy, they just try and bribe them and give them all sorts of baubles and trinkets and so on. And so this is an interesting sort of intro, if you like, into post-World War II US foreign policy, and the idea that these things, such as the democracy, can be imposed